Welcome, Notre Dame fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I am Vince D'Addario. I am the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com. And with me, as always, is Brian Driscoll. He is the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. And we've got a fun little exercise to go through here today. We're going to shift our focus from our player previews and, what who's going to be who and things of that nature. We're going to talk about the coaching staff, and we're going to focus on the offensive coaching staff first. And this is a big year. This is
assistants. Yeah, we're not talking about Brian. We'll have a whole different show about Brian Kelly. And we're also going to have a show later on about Jeff Quinn, so he will not be mentioned about this because he's in a unique situation, different from all the other coaches.
Yeah.
So this is an assistant-driven conversation. So
right, and this is a big year for Notre Dame in general. I mean, it is just because of the guys that they lost, the schedule that's in front of them, the schedule that is next year, the recruiting class that's come in. This is kind of either Notre Dame's going to take that next step up, or I think they're going to take a step back. I don't know that they're going to stay.
It's hard to stay. It's hard to stay there. I mean, that's just the fact because other teams are getting better and teams are getting worse, and so we've seen sort of Notre Dame sort of plateau the last couple of years,
right?
Where you look at it and you say, okay, the last 2 years they've gone, 21-4, I think, right, which is pretty good. But the problem is they're, I think, 3-4 against ranked teams in those 2 years. Teams that finish the season ranked, and then one of those wins is over Navy.
And that's just ranked. That's not top 10. That's
teams that finish ranked. Right. And so, you lost to Clemson and Alabama again this year. You had a nice win over Clemson this year. And as we said at the time, no, it was not a top 5 necessarily or top 3 Clemson, but it was still a good Clemson team, even without those players.
Clemson. It's still Clemson.
Right. And then, you got beat by Clemson and then you beat North Carolina. That was probably the best. I would say that's the best win Notre Dame has had since probably USC 2017. In my opinion, as far as quality of opponent and then impressiveness of the play. So, there's been some good moments, but, lost to Georgia, lost to Clemson, lost to Alabama. And so the question is are they going to ascend and take that next step, or are they going to start to fall back? Because nobody just stays in that almost category, and so this is, to me, the year that they need to take that step because the schedule sets up nicely. The roster sets up nicely, and we're going to find out just how good this coaching staff is, because if they can't thrive this year and make the necessary adjustments and changes this year, then you're not going to do it in 22 and 23 when you've got Clemson and Ohio State on the schedule both years. So that's where we're at. So it's an exciting year and it's a big year, and there's a lot that needs to happen that's going to tell us, this program's ready to take the next step.
So let's kick off this little conversation here, and we'll start at the top, not the very top, not with Brian Kelly, but the top of the offensive food chain, at least as it is, written down that we think is the top of the offensive food chain. And we're going to start with offensive coordinator Tom Rees, Tommy, and, so many things. We've talked about what the offensive philosophy, we've talked about so much that has to do with this offense, but Tommy Rees, in theory, the buck stops at the desk of Tommy Rees. So why, Brian, in your opinion, is this such an important season for Tommy Rees?
I think let's break this down into 3 categories regarding Tommy Rees. Number 1 is the coaching from a position standpoint. Number 2 is coordinating, and number 3 is recruiting. And so let's kind of go in that regard. So number 1, let's talk about coaching. Number 1, you're inheriting a quarterback that is experienced but not experienced in what you do. And then the rest of your depth chart is loaded with guys who have never played a meaningful snap.
Well, they've only been coached by you, though.
Right. Drew Pines played 2. Came in and handed off against Alabama, right? I mean, those are meaningful snaps. I mean, so, I mean, that was they hadn't pulled their starters yet against Alabama. I'd say that's a meaningful snap, but it was, handoffs. You're in a situation where it's time for you to show that you can kind of reload. I mean, you look at the top schools, they lose starting quarterbacks all the time. Alabama loses Tua Tagovailoa, number 5 pick in the NFL draft, and they're even better on offense the next year. We've seen this happen time and time again. Jacob Coker leads them to a national championship in 2015. Jalen Hurts comes in as a true freshman, not a 5-star recruit, not even a top 100 recruit on the composite ranking, leads them to the college football championship game. Then the next year, him and the combination of him and Tua go out and lead them to a national championship. So, then Tua takes over. They go play for the championship again. And we could do the same thing with Clemson. Year after losing Deshaun Watson, you have Kelly Bryant step in. He was not nearly as good as Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson. We still led him back to the playoff. And the only game they lost in the regular season that year was a game he got knocked out of. So, that's just what the good teams do, right? We've seen what Oklahoma's been able to do year after year after year. So, it's time for you to show that, hey, I can develop quarterbacks. And right now, he's really, to me, the track record is spotty, if we're being honest, as a position coach. You coached Brandon Wimbush, who regressed to the point he got benched. You coached Ian Book, whose quarterback rating literally declined every single year he was in the offense. His best quarterback rating was 2018. All of his best numbers were in 2018. 2019, he put up good numbers, but didn't play well in big games. His quarterback rating went down a couple points. And then as a fifth-year senior with 5 starting offensive linemen back and a really weak schedule, his quarterback rating takes a huge drop, down to 140, I believe 144 this year. So, and, I think cases could have been made that there's probably times Ian Book probably should have been benched in 2019, the way he was playing. But, again, he's got to show that, okay, I can kind of take this and we're going to really take this to the next level. What can you get out of Jack Cohn? What are you going to be able to do with a talented player like Tyler Buckner? What are you going to be able to do, with Drew Pine? Are you going to be able to develop different skill sets? And look, Jack Cohn and Tyler Buckner are 2 different players. How are you going to be able to develop those 2 things at the same time? And that's something that experienced coaches have to learn to do. And this is going to be a challenge. And I think Tommy failed at that challenge, if we're being honest, the first time with Ian Book and Phil Dracovic, but he was a young coach. We've all made mistakes. I think we all can look back at our coaching careers and say, boy, I wish I would have handled that kid differently, or I wish I would have done that differently. And that's part of the learning process of coaching. And it sucks that the kids are the ones that have to kind of suffer. But I wish I could have coached my first 2 years as a coach with the knowledge I had by the time I was in year 7. We all have those conversations.
It's a maturity issue. It's an experience issue. It's all of that, because I agree. There's things that I said and did, and the way I coached certain kids my first couple of years, I was like, wow, who was that guy?
Yeah.
But that's all about the maturation process of your coaching. And not to put words in your mouth, but that's one of the reasons you didn't think he was quite ready for this particular position.
Sure. I just thought Tommy Rees, as talented as he is and intelligent as he is, needed a little bit more seasoning. And that's why I thought Joe Moorhead was going to be the right hire, because I felt Joe Moorhead would have given him a different voice, than basically the Brian Kelly voice that he's had throughout his entire adult life, with the exception of 2 years. Right. So but again, still talented kid, talented young man, talented coach. And let's see him kind of develop and learn and take that next step as a position coach. This is an important year for that, because I don't want to hear any excuses from Notre Dame's coaches about, well, we're not that, we're not playing well this year. We're not scoring because excuse A, B, C, and D, right? Okay. I don't want to hear it, because teams lose players all the time.
Right.
You think Alabama's going to score 32 points a game next year? They lose Mac Jones, Devontae Smith, Najee Harris, Alex Leatherwood, Landon Dickerson. Think of all the players they lost. You think they're going to take a huge step back, and you think Nick Saban's going to make any excuses if they do? No.
And they lost their offensive coordinator.
That's right, and offensive line coach, and running backs coach. So, because Charles Huff took the Marshall head coaching job, the offensive line coach left for Texas with Sarkisian. So, they've got a brand new, and he hired Bill O'Brien as his new coordinator. So, anyway, the point is, there's no excuses, right? You're year 12. If you're not ready to reload by year 12, go find something else to do. So, I think that he will, and so I think this is a big year for Coach Rees, and I think that he's gonna be, to me, evaluated on how well are you able to develop your room.
Right.
So that's the coaching point. The coordinating part is interesting, Vince, because I'm going to make a statement, and I want you to tell me if you agree or disagree with it.
All right.
Other than Marcus Freeman, Tommy Rees is the least fireable coach on the Notre Dame coaching staff. And I mean that in this way. Knowing Brian Kelly, knowing how Brian Kelly views his stubbornness when it comes to admitting mistakes with hires. There's no bounds. No way anything could happen this year that would allow him to, that would result in him firing Tommy Rees outside of Tommy Rees doing things that he has no choice. And that's not who Tommy Rees is, right? Tommy Rees.
You're talking like off the field.
Something illegal. Right. And that's not Tommy Rees. That's not going to happen. So if Tommy Rees is in an interesting situation because I'm your guy, right? You picked me over all this national search. He actually has a lot more pull than I think that people realize.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if he realizes it. And I'm saying I don't know because I don't know. I don't talk to Tommy Rees. He doesn't talk to me. So it's a thing where you got to be willing to walk in and have the stones to say, I hope that you're battling him as hard now as you did when you were a player. Because him and Brian Kelly butted heads a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's something Brian Kelly liked about Tommy Rees, because that's why I think he liked Tony Pike so much at Cincinnati. He liked a quarterback that was willing to kind of go back at him.
I did. I liked that when I had a quarterback who would be like, what are we doing? You know, I think
it's got to be done the right way. Right.
I agree. But I want to say that. Yeah.
But, you know, so I want to see I want to see Coach Rees be able to go into Coach Kelly and say, hey, look, we got to make these changes, right? Like, I'm sorry, we've got to do this. We need to get out of the Stone Age offensively, and we need to push the tempo. We need to do this. We need to do that. And then, you know, force Coach Kelly to give you more control. Not in a way where you walk in and say, I want more control, but just your assertiveness, your aggressiveness, your constant leadership as the offensive coordinator is kind of saying, hey, look, this guy's ready. It's time. You know, and I think that's important because, look, if he continues to call the Brian Kelly offense, he's going to struggle in regards to how he stacks up against the other teams. And we're going to hear the excuses about they don't have this playmaker and that playmaker, and they only have 3 top 100, you know, receivers on their roster, or 4 top 100 receivers on their roster. That's clearly not enough, you know, to be good. They only have, you know, the best returning tight end in the country. They only have a bunch of highly ranked, you know, offensive linemen. You know, they only have, you know, 1,000-yard rusher on their roster, and the other guy's just a top 100 guy, you know. I mean, I'm being sarcastic here, right? There's plenty of talent for Notre Dame to be a 38 to 42 point per game team next year. And not just that, but a team that can also then score against the better teams in the schedule, but not if they keep doing what they're doing. And so he needs to do that, Vince. So that's my question is, do you agree with the premise that he has the foot? Because here's the thing. There are certain coaches that can't walk into Brian Kelly's office and say, we need to make those changes. And that's why I say I think Tommy Rees is one of those coaches, because he holds a unique position in that he is the offensive coordinator. He's your chosen one. And there's no way in heck Brian Kelly's going to fire him, because Brian Kelly's not willing to admit that he made a mistake. And I'm not even saying he necessarily made a mistake. That's not the point. So, I mean, do you think he has that kind of leverage, Vince? And do you think he is a guy that would be willing to wield it?
Well, your original premise was that he is the second most unfireable person. I would argue that
Marcus Freeman is the number one.
I would argue he's the most unfireable person. I would make that argument. Look, he is operating. You know, you hear about people operating without a net. You know, he's operating with the biggest net on the planet. Okay, he can get away from a football standpoint. He can get away with whatever he wants at this point, and I don't think that his job is in jeopardy. I really don't. Brian Kelly, the hiring of Marcus Freeman and the hiring of Tommy Rees were 2 completely different animals, right? I mean, it was 2 completely different situations. And I would venture to say that Tommy Rees is still the most unfireable person on the staff. That's his guy, man. You talk about how.
So you're doubling down on what I'm saying. You're saying it's even more.
I am tripling down on what you're saying, because I think that he's got enough in his back pocket because of the way, you know, his relationship with Brian Kelly, the way the hiring went down. He can absolutely walk in there. I mean, shoot, he could probably just say it over family dinner. I mean, that's probably where they could talk about it. Obviously, I'm joking, but I think that they have that kind of a relationship. I think that there's a bit of a father-son, pupil, teacher. You know, they're tight, man, and I believe that wholeheartedly. I think that he could go into that office and they could have a real open dialogue, and he could say, this is what we need to do. Whether he'll do it or not, I think is the big question. And, we don't know what happens behind closed doors, obviously.
It may have already happened for all we know.
It could have. And
don't know.
And BK could have shut him down. We don't know that either. So hopefully it did. But I think he does have the gravitas in this particular position to do that. And I hope that he has or will do that in the very near future.
Because it needs to happen.
I agree.
And there's another coach that is part of this conversation too, but it needs to happen because they need to be able to open up the offense. And I think Coach Reese could thrive
I do too.
in a more modern offense. I think
he's got lots of toys to play with.
Yeah, he can get creative and have some fun with it.
Yes.
And so I hope that he's given that opportunity to do that. Because because again, if anything, it would give Brian Kelly the opportunity to kind of say, "See, I told you so."
Yeah,
all the people that said it was a bad hire, and it would mean nothing because it's like, okay, by year 3, he's doing a great job. Well, look, that was never my issue. My issue was in 2020.
Yes,
you had a team that was designed to make a run,
right,
and you didn't take advantage of it. But I think eventually he's going to be an outstanding coordinator. It's how long is it going to take, and is Brian Kelly going to give him the ability to? I think almost kind of like. He needs to be able to fail a little bit.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is failure is
relative. I mean, it's not saying
fail
go out
like
there and lose to a MAC school. Like, that's not what you're saying.
It's okay. The defense handed me my stuff the first week of fall camp.
Right.
That's what I mean by, you know what I mean? And I've had that happen. We've gone into camp and we thought we had a great plan for how we're going to start camp. And the defense just handed us our lunch the first week of practice. And then we had to make some adjustments. And by the time we got to the season, we were really, really good. But those things happen. That's what I mean by failures. But it's gotta be him, right? It's gotta be his decision, his game plan, his offensive philosophy, his practice plan, those kind of things where he can kind of go out and say, hey, you know what? We didn't get enough work in the run game this week. That's failure. So like spring practice. Hey, you know what? I set a goal for us to get through this part of our install package, and we didn't get to that because I didn't plan appropriately for practice. Those are things I think he needs to experience, success and failure with. And so that's what I'm referring to failure, not like they need to start 0-3 next year and it's going to benefit Tommy Reese. It's every coach, I think, benefits from that kind of stuff. But when you're having things dictated to you in the manner in which I believe Brian Kelly dictates things on offense, it makes it a lot more challenging. So that to me is kind of why I believe Coach Reese is a guy that has to step up in that regards.
And the third topic on Coach Reese, I think, for me, is the one with the biggest question mark right now. It's as a recruiter. And the current cycle, the current recruiting cycle for quarterbacks, normally the quarterback is in the class by now, at least as far as I can tell. And I'm not necessarily, and that's saying that that's his fault or whatever, but I also feel like the guys that are being recruited by Notre Dame, or at least the guys that I've seen being recruited by Notre Dame, they're not the home run hits that I was hoping that they would be going after, if that makes sense. And I know you probably have your own take on it. This is my understanding, kind of on the outside looking in. I feel like he could do so much better. I mean, I don't feel like he's reaching far enough. Yeah.
There's some quarterbacks out there that I know for a fact have a lot of interest in Notre Dame that are better than all but one of the kids that they're currently in my opinion. One of the quarterbacks they've offered I like a lot, and that's Gavin Wimsatt from Kentucky. He's a dude. He's a top 50 recruit. Steve Angeli, to me, is not a needle-moving quarterback.
And he's the guy that everybody's saying he's like the #1 guy on Notre Dame's board, from what I've heard.
We'll see. We'll see. I mean, I have some skepticism about that because I kind of feel like if that were true, he might have already been in the class by now. But we'll see. Maybe he is purposely slow playing. He's not a needle-mover recruit. There's guys like Drew Aller, who I'm going to have an article on, Sam Horn, who I'm going to have an article on. So the COVID thing, I'm not going to blast them for not having a quarterback by now. I would rather you wait to get the right quarterback than to get a guy early. I forgot about COVID. That's a really good point because they're not able to camps last summer. They had this class especially is going to be challenging because these guys haven't. It's been over a year. It's been about a year now since these kids were able to be on campus.
Sure.
And when this dead period's over, it's going to be over a year. And so a lot of these kids weren't old enough to really make visits. And some of the kids that are just now kind of becoming top recruits, they weren't necessarily top recruits when Notre Dame was last able to get kids on campus for games. I mean, they could bring 0 kids really in for games this year. So I'm going to give them a little bit of a pass on not having a quarterback in the class, because to me, I don't really care. I mean, Alabama's, you look at them, and them and Ohio State are going about recruiting two different ways. Ohio State's loading up early, and Alabama loads up late. There's different ways to get it done. I just get it done, right? Yeah. That's the point.
I get it.
So, yeah, I have some questions about quarterback recruiting, but for me, the recruiting aspect of it is much, much bigger than just the quarterback recruiting. To me, it's if we're being honest, almost the best receivers they had in last year's class were guys that committed when Chip Long was still the offensive coordinator. With the exception of Rocco Spindler, they didn't add a single guy to the class that was a top recruit since Tommy Rees took over. You could say the two running backs, but neither of those guys were top recruits. I mean, LSU got involved with Logan Diggs late, but Notre Dame didn't beat out a bunch of SEC schools for Logan Diggs. Now, I think he's a very good player. Don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing him then. I'm saying it's a lot easier to get a Logan Diggs when LSU offered almost a year after he committed to you than it is to get Logan Diggs when, LSU was offered him when you offered him. And
it's already home field advantage. I mean, you're already back from a
Audric Estime, they beat Michigan State for, right? He was committed to Michigan State, right? They didn't beat Ohio State and Penn State. So that's my thing is, I look at some of the recruiting and you say, okay, well, they just added a running back from Texas, very good player. That's a good start. But, he's got some areas where he doesn't have a lot of help, where we'll get into Coach Alexander here and Del Alexander in a minute, but, Chip Long was able to overcome that. If, you go follow the recruitments of Lorenzo Styles, for example, and Jordan Johnson and Xavier Watts, Chip Long was the driving force behind those. And Tommy Rees assisted in some of those. Tommy Rees assisted with Jordan Johnson to a degree. I remember when we first talked to Jordan Johnson, the coach who was recruiting him at the time was Tommy Rees, actually, not Del Alexander.
Huh.
So that was, and it was just sort of, that was his one of his regions, and he was the one that got him on the door and his foot in the door. And then, of course, Chip Long came in and helped finish that. So, how is he going to be as a recruiter? Is not just himself. As I've talked to recruits that I've had people that are doing recruiting for us now that have talked to recruits, and they say, look, he's hitting the right buttons with kids individually. That's a good thing. But can he close?
Yeah.
Right. That's the question. Can he close with top players? Can he close with Caleb Brown? Can he overcome Michigan and Ohio State for a guy like Caleb Brown?
That's huge.
That's a huge thing for him, because he is a game changer. And he's in Chicago. He goes to St. Rita, right? Catholic school kid from Chicago.
Right.
You got to get it done.
Notre Dame's wheelhouse, right there.
And so, and they say, well, you got to be able to go into the room and say, hey, Lance, we got to get this done. Hey, Jeff, we got to get this done. Hey, Dell, we got to get this done, man. I need you to up your game, because we got to get this kid in the class. That's what a coordinator has to be able to do if he's going to be a great recruiter.
Yes.
And you don't have a head coach that's going to do that. So you have to do that.
Yeah.
And so does a 28-year-old guy have the confidence in himself to walk in there and have that stern conversation sometimes with someone who's much older than he is?
Right.
But you need to be able to do that in order to make this work. And so that's what we need to see from Coach Rees. And that's, I have my concerns about that, because again, I need to see him close, and it's concerns because we just haven't seen it. I need to see him close.
Yeah.
And if he's not able to do that, then this class is going to kind of revert back to what it has been, which is a really up and down, inconsistent year. Same thing, offensive line, they got to close. Tight end recruiting is a bit head scratching. Running back recruiting is looking good, but they got to finish, right? Receiver recruiting, there's a lot of guys on the board, but do they lead for any of the top guys? Okay, well, then you got to come from behind and go get it done.
Yeah.
So those are the things that I look at and say, that combination of three things make this a big year, because the roster that you're going to have in 22 and 23 and 24 and 25 as you're looking to make this run is going to primarily be driven by the class you just brought in, which again, we had a heavy Chip Long influence, in this class. And, you talk about saying, well, we don't have enough playmakers. Well, go get some, because there's some out there at places that are pro Notre Dame areas that you got to go get it done.
And that's the best part about coaching in college. There's no salary cap. You know what I mean? You can go get playmakers like that. That's my thing. You don't have to work. Well, we're in a small market. We're this, we're that. You're at Notre friggin' Dame. Okay. Right. You can go get, if you work hard enough, you can get those dudes. You can get them in the class, and they're eligible to play right away. This isn't 1962 where freshmen can't play. So you can change the narrative very, very quickly if you're at Notre Dame. And I think that's what frustrates the heck out of me is that we hear that, oh, we don't have this, we don't have that. Well, whose fault is that?
Right.
Go get them.
Right. Well, first of all, they have that, but let's not go there because you're gonna distract me and I want to kind of get back on track. But yeah,
explode
agree. They got to get it done. And so again, we're not saying he's not going to do it.
Right.
We're saying this is really his first. This is his first class. That's going to be his class.
Agreed.
Right, as the coordinator, and he needs to show that he can close. I like what I'm hearing so far. I'll say this as a positive. Talked to a couple guys that I have on the recruiting chart right now, and they're talking to a lot of these top players, and a lot of them, especially Midwest guys, they say, "Hey, I talk to Coach Reese all the time. He's really like him." So his name is being mentioned a lot. But okay, can he turn that into I think he's cool to I want to go play for that guy?
Yeah, right. Big
right.
Difference. Big difference.
And that's the key.
Let's switch the conversation. Let's go running backs, Brian. Let's talk about Lance Taylor because I think he's been a great addition to the staff. Overall, I've been very happy with him. I know you've probably got information that I don't have, which is why we're talking about this. But the running back position itself, I think, has the ability to take a real step forward. And that's not saying that it wasn't good last year because Kyron Williams is a 1,000-yard rusher. That's great. He was the threat out of the backfield. That's great. Chris Tyree, we know how great he can be. Obviously you and I think he should have more touches, but I think this is an opportunity this year to get both of those guys on the field. You could have 2,000-yard rushers very easily in this backfield at Notre Dame. How does Lance Taylor make that happen?
I think Lance has definitely added a lot to the depth chart. I mean, I don't think he's a great recruiter yet, but he's certainly a much better recruiter than what Autry Denson was. I mean, that's not saying a whole lot, though. I think coaching-wise, I think he's done a good job so far. I mean, like you said, Tony Jones, if Tony Jones doesn't get hurt, Tony Jones is a 1,000-yard rusher in 2019, and Tony Jones averaged about 0.6 yards more per carry than Kyron Williams did this past year. Actually, the yards per carry for the starting running back went down this year with Kyron Williams, and I don't think that's necessarily on him as much as it is the offensive philosophy, but I think there's another level Notre Dame needs to get to with its running game and its running backs. I mean, Notre Dame last year ranked 29th in the country in yards per attempt at 5.02. Compare that to Ohio State, who was at 5.96. North Carolina was 5.75. I mean, that's a big jump. And when you consider the talent of the Notre Dame offensive line, Alabama, for example, last year averaged 5.0 yards per carry. Okay. Notre Dame was 5.02 yards per carry. So they were very similar. But Alabama's quarterback barely had over 0 yards this last year. Matter of fact, going into the Notre Dame game, he was minus yards, right? Yeah. So, let's just, you kind of compare that and you say, well, Ian Book, Notre Dame starting quarterback, averaged 4.2 yards per rush, and he had over 400 yards rushing last year. Alabama starting quarterback Mac Jones had a whopping 14 yards at 0.4 yards per carry. So when you look at the running backs, the starting running backs at Alabama, Najee Harris was 5.84 yards per carry. Brian Robinson was at 10.3, and their freshman Jace McClellan was at 10.7 on 23 carries. Chris Tyree was at 6.8 yards per carry, but they just used him as a breather guy. Yeah. Tebow was 5.2 and Kyron was 5.3. So it was good, but you were a running team. Alabama was a passing team that would kind of, the run game wasn't always the driving force. So their number 2 aspect was as good as your number 1 aspect. Right. That's my issue. Right. And so I think there's another level to get to. There's a lot of factors that go into this that don't necessarily have a lot to do with Lance Taylor per se.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely.
But I want to see him. I want to see him do some things. I want to see him as the run game coordinator and as someone who has coached receivers kind of with Tommy Rees to say, hey, let's be more creative. Let's be more explosive. We've got some really talented running backs. Let's figure out ways to use both of them. We use both of them. Kyron's a starter and Chris plays when Kyron needs a breather. We use both of them. That's not what we're talking about. Where I kind of say he's got to have the plan, because you can't expect the head coach to come up with that. You've got to come up with the plan and you've got to make it work, right? So, what are we going to see from Coach Taylor in that regards? As a former receivers coach with a running back that is a former receiver, I think that there's some more I'd like to see him kind of help install into the offense. I mean, remember, he was Christian McCaffrey's coach back at Stanford, and Christian McCaffrey caught a lot of passes. Now, I am not saying Kyron Williams is Christian McCaffrey. He is not. My point, however, is that I know that there's a lot of ideas that he has on how to do that.
Sure.
I'd like to see him really this year be allowed to do that more. And then, of course, come up with ways where you can start getting more out of both of your running backs. I mean, look, North Carolina played basically the same schedule Notre Dame played.
That's true.
And had 2,000-yard running backs last year.
They were the 1-2 punch in the ACC, as they were the 2 first-team All-ACC running backs from the same team.
Yeah. I mean, so you're telling me that Michael Carter, who was the number one rusher yards per game in the ACC, Javonte Williams is number 3. They both averaged over 7 yards a carry. Combined for 28 touchdowns. And guess what? They still threw for over 300 yards a game.
So they were a passing
team.
A
schematic. Well, they were a running team, I would argue. But because a lot of the stuff they did was RPOs and things like that. But the point being, a team in your league that plays a relatively similar schedule is capable of having that, and it's not Clemson. Okay?
Right.
So you can't say, well, these are 5-star recruits and all this other stuff, right? So the point being, both of those guys averaged almost 2 yards more per carry than Kyron Williams, right? He was at 5.3. Then Javonte Williams is at 7.3. Michael Carter was at 8 yards a carry, okay? Khalil Herbert from Virginia Tech was at 7.7 yards per carry. The point is, in this league, a lot of these other running backs are going for – Duke's top running back was 6.8 yards per carry.
Yeah. Right.
There's a lot of backs averaging a lot high yards per carry relative to Notre Dame, and I don't think it's about talent. So I want to see Coach Taylor kind of have an influence on how are some ways we can create a more explosive ground attack. The pass game is going to be part of that.
Yeah.
Right. The more you have to worry about your running backs out of the backfield and the RPOs and all those other kind of things, then the more dangerous those inside zones. It's kind of like, when you look at 2017, part of the reason Josh Adams had such a high yards per carry, it wasn't just that they had a great offensive line, because none of the other backs, had quite that. I mean, Deion McIntosh still got yards, but it wasn't like 7 yards a carry. The reason Dexter and Josh Adams had such a high yards per carry was also when they were in the game, if you watched it, teams were so worried about Brandon Wimbush running the football. I remember the 80-yard touchdown run Josh Adams had against USC. If you go back and watch that play, and watch when he gets it's just an inside zone. He cuts behind Alex Bars, the backside linebacker, the overhang defender, and the safety to that side are all running at Brandon Wimbush as Josh Adams is running vertically. So those were things that the system itself allowed those opportunities, because those safeties couldn't just key on Josh Adams.
Yeah.
That's gone now, because number one, you don't have Brandon Wimbush at quarterback from a running standpoint. But number two, that's where the RPOs and the different things like that come into play, where you're running an inside zone and you got Chris Tyree on a swing route opposite Kyron Williams running that inside zone. You got to worry about that, because if you don't, you throw a quick screen pass or a quick swing pass to Chris Tyree, he's catching it, getting up the sideline for a home run. So they have to do things that keep the defense more occupied, because if safeties have to take an extra second before they can fly downhill, that extra second is the difference between Kyron Williams going for 10 and Kyron Williams going for 50.
Yep.
Or Chris Tyree going for 10, or Chris Tyree going for 80.
Yep.
You get what I'm saying? So I put a lot of that on Coach Taylor, because he's proven to be able to generate that kind of explosiveness out of the backfield. And, I want to see him be able to bring that to Notre Dame. I love what he's done so far. Fundamentally sound. Guys improve each year. This is a big year for him, because you've got a returning starter that's a very good back, second-team All-American Sporting News, and you've got one of the most explosive players in the entire country in your running back field. If you can't get production from that, you got to, at some point in time, you got to stop blaming the players.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
well, I'm sorry. They need to stop blaming the players a long time ago.
But
that's another podcast right down.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. Look, Lance Taylor, he's the run game coordinator, right? I mean, he has that title, so he's got to say. It's not like he's just a position coach who is beholden to everything else that's going on around him, and all he's worried about is, are they taking the handoff the correct way, right? He is the offensive offensive run game coordinator. So there has to be some blame isn't the right word, but he has a responsibility to make sure that the run game is operating at the most peak efficiency, and it's not yet. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's not. And so, and all you have to do is look in the conference, right? And so, as you did, and I'm hoping that, again, he has the gravitas, he has the stones, whatever you want to say, to go to Tommy Rees and be like, look, this is what we need to do with the run game. I've got two thoroughbreds back here who need to get touches. We need to get them the ball. Let's think of some creative ways to get both of them involved in this offense.
So from what my sources have told me over the last year is that Tommy Rees and Lance Taylor have a very good relationship.
Beautiful.
Like, very open.
Yeah.
They listen to each other. They talk to each other. So I don't think Lance Taylor going in there and having ideas would be an issue. It's just more about them coming up with things to then take it to the boss man and say, this is what we need to do. Like, there needs to be this unified front of, yes, we need to push the tempo more. No, we do not need to be Oregon under Chip Kelly. Right. But if North Carolina can do this in the ACC, why the freaking heck can't we do this in the ACC? And then you start doing what North Carolina is doing with the talent that Notre Dame has, not just at the skill players, but on the offensive line. Because no one's talking about North Carolina's offensive linemen being, day one and day two draft picks like they're talking about Notre Dame's offensive linemen, right? And Sam Howell's a good football player. He's not Trevor Lawrence. So you can't use that, of course Clemson's good because they have Trevor Lawrence. Well, Sam Howell ain't Trevor Lawrence.
Right.
Okay? He's a good player. Don't get me wrong, but you're telling me that Drew Pine and Tyler Buckner and all the guys that Notre Dame recruits year after year can't be that? Yeah, they can.
Yes, they can.
It's just they've committed to a system that allows them to do that. And then you have Notre Dame's defense doing what they do. That's the recipe that we keep talking about. So, that's where they are. And that's where I say it's a big year for Coach Taylor to be able to say, okay, now go get that done. You look at his last year at Stanford, Christian McCaffrey averaged 6.3 yards per carry. Bryce Love was a 7.1. Right, had over 700 yards rushing. So he showed
they were
even
together in the same back.
Right. And so, you had the best running back in the country, and you were still able, top 10 NFL draft pick, who some have argued is the best running back in the NFL, and you still found a way to get your number two back, some playing time. So, and some productive playing time. So, I think that it's a situation where it's now year 3 for him. It's time for him to be able to step up and say, hey, let's go get this thing done. And you look at it, that was McCaffrey's junior year, was Bryce Love's sophomore year. The year before, Christian McCaffrey had over 2,000 yards, and the next highest running back was Barry Sanders at 315.
Yeah,
kind of similar to what we saw.
Just saying
this year. So, but then Bryce Love as a freshman only had 29 carries, averaged 7.8 yards a carry.
Yeah.
That's not what, he did. Chris Tyree, similar, type situation. So the next year, Bryce Love became a much more used weapon, and they had a dynamic backfield. And and again, part of that was, if you go back and look, Bryce Love got some production when Christian McCaffrey was out.
Sure.
And so it's kind of, it can be a little misleading, that production.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't all done with them together.
Yeah.
Kind of like the CJ Prosise, Josh Adams 1-2 punch in 2015 for Notre Dame. So, but at the same time, there were some games where they both played and they both had production. So that's what I want to see from the Notre Dame backfield this year. And Lance Taylor's got to be a big part of that. He needs to utilize his relationship with Tommy Rees to say, let's build around these strengths, and then let's kind of get together and go to the boss man and say, hey, coach, this is what we need to do. There's no reason we can't be scoring on the same level that North Carolina is scoring, especially since we have a defense that can make more stops.
Good call. So let's move outside to the wide receiver position, Brian. And this is the one where, I don't want to take a turn to negative town. That's not where I want to go. But we're going to talk about Dell Alexander. And look, on the face of it, he's bringing in some great recruits. The youth movement at the wide receiver position is unbelievable. The problem is they're not getting on the field. The other issue is those guys aren't in a Notre Dame uniform because of Dell Alexander, from everything that I can gather. So this is a big year for him, because if those young guys are going to see the field, they're going to have to get coached up. And what is that going to look like? Are you insistent on throwing the Bible at them and having to know everything chapter and verse? Or is it going to be a situation where, hey, this is what these guys do best. Here's how we need to get them involved. And is that all on Del Alexander? So a lot of different things to talk about with Coach Alexander, Brian.
So let me say what Coach Alexander's done a really good job with.
Okay. Start with positive. I like that.
When he has a veteran group, he's been able to do a good job getting the most out of them. I think the issues this year with the wide receivers that played was not a Del Alexander problem. It was
that's fair
offensive philosophy problem, right? Because one thing we've argued is Javon McKinley's open a lot more than people realize.
Yeah.
You know, I'm having the same arguments with Javon McKinley that I had with Notre Dame fans about Chase Claypool when they said, well, Notre Dame didn't have enough speed at receiver. I'm like, well, wait till the combine. We had the same conversation with Miles Boykin. I'm like, I'm at the Cotton Bowl. I'm up high. I can look down, see everything, and I'm watching Miles Boykin smoke corners on post routes. It should be for touchdowns, and the ball doesn't come. That's not a wide receiver problem. That's not a separation problem. That's a quarterback problem. So I don't blame him for I think he's been able to, when guys are in this system for a while, they're able to develop, and he's able to get veterans to play at a high level. Having said that, the issue that I have is that's 20 years ago, right? This is an era where young players are more ready to play than ever, but they're not usually guys that are walking the door and you don't need to coach them up kind of guys. The problem that Notre Dame has, and this isn't all Del Alexander.
Agreed.
I'm confident in saying that Del Alexander has a lot dictated to him
I agree
as far as what he's going to do. So the coaching aspect of it, there's some limitations to it. I think Coach Alexander needs to step up and use his voice more. Sure. He's a very experienced coach. Yep. I mean, you go back and look at his track record at Arizona State, his track record at Wisconsin. This is a guy that's produced some good receiving cores. He's a good football coach. I don't think he uses his voice enough. I think he allows things to be dictated to him and just kind of chalks it up. I think he does a poor job of, once the season starts, of coaching younger players. He just kind of, these are my starters and this is who I'm working with, and we'll worry about the young guys in the offseason. That's a poor philosophy.
Right.
That's on him. He's got to change that, okay? And so those are some things I think he needs to do a better job with, number one. The bigger issue for me with him is recruiting. Yes, he needs to get Kevin Austin and Braden Lindsey going as veterans, but he also has to work his tail off to make sure Jordan Johnson and Xavier Watts are ready to go out and ball this year. Same with Lawrence Keys. Stop brushing guys aside and focusing on their limitations. Focus on the things they do, coach those things up and use them. He needs to do a better job of that, but he really needs to step it up in recruiting. And this is one of those things where people look at the receiver classes and say, well, they just signed a top 10 receiver class. They got Lorenzo Styles and Deion Colsey, and they lost Deion Colsey initially because of a lack of contact. That's just fact, right? I've talked to multiple sources down in Georgia. Deion Colsey's too classy to say this. He's too respectful. He comes from a great family. They are not going to bash Coach Alexander publicly because they are not that kind of people. I'll say it for them. It wasn't the only reason.
No, I know.
There were other reasons, but that was a fact.
The way you said it, that's
while these other coaches are talking to him every day, the Notre Dame receivers coach is just kind of like, well, he's already committed. That's not how recruiting works, number one. Number two, you look at Lorenzo Styles, Lorenzo Styles' primary recruiter was not Del Alexander, it was Chip Long. Same thing with Jordan Johnson. I mean, I would argue that Del Alexander was the third factor from a personal standpoint in Jordan Johnson picking Notre Dame. And Del Alexander had almost no impact on Xavier Watts committing to Notre Dame. So you look at it and say, well, where's his role? I mean, look, we had a guy at an event this weekend, a 7-on-7 event, talking to some of the top 100 recruits, and they're like, yeah, I love Coach Reese. He's a good guy, blah, blah, blah. Well, what about Coach Alexander?
Who?
I mean, that's kind of the reaction, and that's bad. There was a top 250 receiver that Brian Kelly had been on the phone with, Tommy Reese had been on the phone with, and then it kind of got passed on to Coach Alexander. And it's like, you haven't heard from them in a while. And you're just like, what are you doing here? And there's a couple receivers here and there that'll say, I talk to Coach Alexander all the time, but this is the point that I've always made, because we've heard this with other coaches in the past. Well, I talked to this kid. He says he hears from all the time, because the guy's focused on like 5 guys.
Yeah. That's a problem.
To recruit a position at receiver like Notre Dame, you got to have a bigger board.
Yes.
And you got to treat all those guys like dudes.
Yep.
Right. I have from talking to some people I had at a 7-on-7 event, Ryan Day's name is mentioned more that's a head coach of Ohio State, is mentioned more as far as I talk to him more. These are just receivers. Then I talk to the Notre Dame wide receivers coach whose only flipping job is to recruit wide receivers in Notre Dame. That's unacceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, Caleb Brown should hear from Del Alexander on the regular.
Yes.
Right? CJ Williams should have, and it's too late for that. I think that ship has pretty much sailed now. Same with Teteroa McMillan. That ship has sailed first. You're an LA guy. You're from Los Angeles. This was part of the reason you were brought in. And you can't even make a dent with a kid. I mean, there's pictures of CJ Williams giving interviews talking about, that they're using an older photo, and he's wearing a Notre Dame shirt, but Notre Dame isn't even in the mix now. So I'm seeing this stuff and I'm saying, and then you read the articles and then you talk to people that know these kids and you're like, yeah, Notre Dame just didn't really make much of a push for him. Well, Tommy Rees can't recruit every single receiver. Right. And that's, and as much as Chip Long got along, I mean, if it was just about Chip Long, Jalen McMillan's at Notre Dame. Right. But it can't just be about the coordinator for every kid. You also have to have some situations where you need to be able to say, hey, we need the head coach involved. We need the receiver coach involved. And that's where Notre Dame has fallen short. And that's why they've had really good receiver classes. But here's the big thing, Vince. I'm tired of Notre Dame saying, well, look, we had a good class. Yes, but it should have been better. Right. It could have been better if you put in the work. You're Notre Dame. You're always going to get top players. You have to be the most incompetent staff ever, Ty Willingham, to not get good recruits at Notre Dame. Right? It's about whether or not you're willing to put in the work to have great classes at Notre Dame. Yes. And so that's the issue is, and until Coach Alexander starts grinding on the recruiting trail, it's like he's really comfortable. And I don't like comfortable coaches because comfortable coaches tend to
get lazy. They get lazy. Just say it.
I would just say complacent. I don't think it's about laziness. I think that because I think Del Alexander works, but what is your work being geared towards?
Right. Complacency is lazy to me, but that's me.
To me, yeah, I don't think. See, to me, I think laziness is I'm just sitting at the office, eating Cheetos, watching TV. That's not what Coach Alexander is doing. It's I'm going to focus more over here and not over here, right? And that's to me, it's not putting enough emphasis on this very important part of your job. And I think to me, that's why. I don't view it as lazy, and I'd be willing to call a coach lazy if he was lazy. Okay, I'm just saying, I don't think that's the issue with Coach Alexander. I think it's more about just not putting enough emphasis. But when your head coach doesn't put as much emphasis on recruiting in regards to his daily activity and being involved, and if the head coach isn't going to challenge you on your board every other day, like what happens at Ohio State, what happens at Clemson, what's happened at Oklahoma and Alabama, then you're gonna be able to get away. Coach, when you have only talk to the coach every once in a while about recruiting. Well, we tried, but the kid wasn't interested. You think Brian Kelly's going to go look at the logs and do digging to find out if that was actually the case? No, he's not. And so if you don't like recruiting necessarily, you don't love recruiting, then you're not. Look, Chip Long loved recruiting. Mike Elko, I think, really likes recruiting, and that's why they're good at it. Clark Lee liked getting recruits, but I don't think he necessarily liked recruiting.
With the grind of it,
yeah. And so if you don't have a head coach that's forcing guys like that to recruit, then you're going to see this. So that's why I say it's up to Coach Rees to be able to go to Coach Alexander and say, hey, look, if you don't talk to Caleb Brown, every other day at least, we're going to have to go into the boss man's office and have a conversation. You know what I mean? I mean, that's what you got to do. I mean, but the reality is head coach or you shouldn't have to do that, right? But that's what's needed. I mean, they've got to step it up and recover in this recruiting class because they're going to have another good recruiting class, a receiver. But we're going to look back again and say, but what if they would have gotten Caleb Brown? Sure. What if they would have got CJ Williams? What, don't complain to me about your lack of playmakers in 3 years when these guys are balling at other schools and you could have had them if you just would have put in the work. Yep. And it's not admission. It's not an admissions problem.
It's not.
It's not that these kids don't care about academics. That is far from the truth with a lot of these kids. So that's kind of where I say it. For Coach Alexander, he's got to step it up. It's a big year for him on and off the field. He's got to step up. And if he doesn't, some hard conversations need to be had.
Well, Brian, that's going to do it for this edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast, talking offensive coaches and why this is such a big year. Oh, I felt like my head was going to explode there a couple of times. I need to take a breath. I need to chill out a little bit. But make sure you stay locked into IrishBreakdown.com. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. They hit that little bell down there that gets you those notifications so you know when we go live, when we've got new videos dropping. It's all very, very important. And, of course, subscribe wherever you get your podcast because guess what? That's pretty important too. But, again, make sure you stay locked into IrishBreakdown.com. And we will have why this is a big year for the defensive coaches as well. So make sure you keep a lookout for that because it will be coming down your way very, very soon. So for Brian, I'm Vince, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.